Thank you. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I'm Ingrid Munson. I'm the Quincy Jones Professor of African American Music here at Harvard and the director of the Jazz Research Initiative at the Hutchins Center. This is our inaugural event for the initiative, and so I'm really glad that you're all here, and I think we'll find Randy Weston's music to be the perfect antidote to bad election news. As you've seen in the photographs displayed on your way in, the materials in Randy Weston's personal collection are rich and far-reaching. Mr. Weston, who has a lifelong awareness of history, saved scores, posters, correspondence, recordings, contracts, and lectures from all periods of his long and illustrious career. These materials not only document Mr. Weston's story, but how his career intersected with the vast community of jazz musicians, listeners, and organizations, the African American community, and the historical moments that shaped the world around him. They especially show his commitment to making a difference through music, raising awareness of African culture and its impact on African American music, and standing up for what is right. Before I introduce Mr. Weston and Robin Kelly, I'd like to say a few words about how we got to this evening. I first met Randy Weston in 1997 when he came to St. Louis for a conference on jazz and the civil rights movement, which I had organized with Professor Gerald Early at Washington University in St. Louis. We wanted to have a speaker who could talk about the connections between African American music and Africa, and I knew Randy Weston was that person. He told the story with eloquence, joy, and ethical determination. He opened new vistas for me on the legacy of Marcus Garvey in Brooklyn and the community of Africans in New York in the 1950s and the 1960s. He changed my life with both what he said and how he said it. When I learned that Randy Weston's archive was available, I knew immediately that I wanted Harvard to be its home. The Hutchins Center, after all, is for African and African American research, and I knew that Weston's materials would include both. Now that they are here, we are in the process of preserving them and making them available to the public so that his wonderful music and commitment to a better world will always be known. Through digitization and web-based projects, we will bring his legacy to light. I'd like to thank several people who made this acquisition possible, beginning with Sarah Adams, the French librarian at the Loeb Music Library, who was convinced that we could be successful and always pushed us forward in the process. Without her enthusiasm and commitment, we would not be here this evening. I would also like to thank Chris Calhoun, who's in the audience tonight, and James Goldwasser, who served as Mr. Weston's agents in preparing the materials on offer. We have just seen Mr. Goldwasser's photos on the screen. I'd also like to thank Sarah Thomas, the Vice President of Harvard Library, and Thomas Hyrie, the Fearington Library of Houghton Library. They were instrumental in securing the central funding that made the Weston Archive at Harvard a reality. We were also generously supported by Dean Michael Smith and Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who is here in the audience, and is also, here's to Skip. And he is the director of the Hutchins Center, and he has also generously supported this evening's festivities. Let's give them all a round of applause. Next, I'd like to ask Sarah Adams to come up and say a few words on behalf of the library.
I speak on behalf of the Music Library and my Harvard Library colleagues when I say that we are delighted to have brought Randy Weston's fabulous collection to Harvard. We'll be able to make it widely available to musicians, students, and researchers, both within the university and to the worldwide community beyond. And I'd also like to add my thanks to our coalition of partners that Ingrid just named, without whose support this acquisition simply wouldn't have been possible. Just over 2 years ago, Ingrid and I spent a memorable day in New York where the Westons warmly welcomed us into their home to view Randy's personal archive. We marveled at the collection's depth, breadth, and organization, and many treasures, Randy's wonderfully rich stories broadening its context for us. The whole experience reinforced our already strong sense that his collection is a gold mine for the study of jazz and so much else, and we very much wanted it to come to Harvard. With its many connections to Africa, as you have heard, as well as its potential to support teaching and research across numerous disciplines, his collection has a global reach that is unusual among jazz archives, enhancing its appeal to us. The Music Library has long supported research in all kinds of music, and over the last few decades, we've endeavored to build an extensive collection of resources for the teaching and research of jazz and related African American musics. As our first major jazz archival acquisition, the Randy Weston collection is a centerpiece in our developing environment. We're now working to make it available, digitizing unique materials both for their preservation and in order to make them as broadly accessible as we can. We're excited by the opportunity to promote Randy Weston's legacy and in this way, and in so doing, to preserve an important and internationally significant musical cultural heritage. I'll turn the floor back over to Ingrid for the next part of our program.
So we're going to have about 45 minutes of conversation with Mr. Weston, followed by an hour of music from his fantastic group, the African Rhythms Quintet, with T.K. Blue, Alex Blake, Neil Clark, and Robert Trowers. First, I'm going to introduce to you Robin D.G. Kelly, the Gary Nash Chair in U.S. History at UCLA, who is a close friend of Mr. Weston's and the author of many, many important books, and you should read all of them. I'm serious. I'll only mention the two that are especially relevant to tonight's topic. The first one is Africa Speaks, America Answers, Modern Jazz in Revolutionary Times. And the second is Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original. It's the very, very best biography of Monk and the only one receiving the support of the Monk family. And finally, let's welcome our honored guest, pianist, composer, and cultural ambassador, Randy Weston. As one of the first musicians to deeply engage with his musical roots in Africa, Randy Weston occupies a pivotal place in American music. A pianist of powerful intensity and originality, Weston emerged from a thriving musical scene in 1950s Brooklyn, which included people like Max Roach, George Russell, Ahmed Abdul Malik, and Miles Davis. His most enduring musical influence is Thelonious Monk, who personally nurtured his talent. He went on to tour 5 continents and collaborate with luminaries such as Langston Hughes, Duke Ellington, Max Roach, and many others. It's an honor to have him here, and we welcome you with all our heart. Is Randy coming out? Okay.
Okay.
So Robin's got the first question.
Okay, well, before I ask this question, I just have to say, as the one non-Harvard person here, what an honor it is, especially, with you, Ingrid, that the papers are here at Harvard and the kind of care that you took to make sure that the work was done, wonderful library staff. It just was an amazing day today to see that. And I know that you took special care So when Randy had these conversations and I had conversations about where the paper should go, clearly this is the home. So just thank you for making it a home.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so I know that a lot of you want to hear Randy, a lot of you want to hear some music, so I'm not going to say too much, but I want to actually begin at the beginning. Not the real beginning, of course, that's Africa, but let's begin with the Brooklyn beginning, And I'm just wondering, thinking about what it meant for you to grow up in a community that's so diverse, musically, ethnically, and to have a father who is a Garveyite from Panama, a mother who grew up in the South, and to bring all that culture to you in Brooklyn. What's special about Brooklyn? What are some of your recollections of Brooklyn?
Well, we grew up in an area in Brooklyn they called Bedford-Stuyvesant, and people were from everywhere but there. But the whole emphasis was music. Mm-hmm. There was no disco, no television, live music. Right. You could walk down a street in Brooklyn. Sumner Avenue was called when I was a boy. Now it's called Marcus Garvey Boulevard, Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn. You could be walking down the street, and here's a restaurant playing Duke Ellington's Main Stem out loud. Right. And you could hear the music, you see. So it was the black church on Sunday. You have to be there or else. Short pants, bow tie. You got to experience that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Blues group on the corner, big band. Stuyvesant Avenue, UB Blake. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in those days, the musicians were so spiritual, our elders, that you didn't have to call them and say, Mr. Blake, can I come and see you? No. I go to UB Blake's house and ring the bell. Sit down, boy. Sit down there. And he'd tell me about the piano battles of 1890, so on and so on. He'd tell me about One Leg Willie. One Leg Willie was the greatest pianist. He never made a record, never heard of him. He said he could take one song and change the harmonies in every chorus, So there was Yubi. There's the great Max Roach, who was my great teacher. He lived 2 blocks away from my dad's house, plus my dad opened a restaurant at the same time. So you go to Max Roach's house, that's where I met Charlie Parker. That's where I met Miles Davis. That's where I met Dizzy Gillespie. That's where I met George Russell, who was working on a great work of Dizzy. Gillespie was so far advanced. He's probably one of our greatest geniuses. Because he was only a great trumpeter, arranger, conductor, band leader, comedian. Mm-hmm. But he also had a great vision of Africa. And he was composing pieces about Africa in the late 1940s. He wrote a particular song called Kush, I'll never forget that, which is ancient Nubian civilization. So George Russell was living with Max Roach at that particular time. And Dizzy made a very major move. He bought the great Chano Pozo, African-Cuban drummer from Cuba, a master. Take one drum and make sounds out of that drum. And he brought Chano Pozo to New York. Mm-hmm. And when I heard that African drum, that changed everything, you see. So Brooklyn was wonderful. We had Cecil Payne, great baritone saxophonist, Duke Jordan, who was Charlie Parker's original trio with Miles Davis, Max Roach, and Tommy Potter. And we'd have rehearsals all day. And I have to point out, there was no separation between the musicians and the people. Mm-hmm. So a guy could be shining your shoes, whistling a Charlie Parker solo, and he wasn't a musician. Right. So there was absolutely no separation. And I have to point out that black audience, that African-American audience, well, you better play right. Yeah, they knew music. They loved music, and all of us, you had to take trumpet lessons or dancing lessons or saxophone. And one more thing I'd like to add. Our mother and fathers, they brought the best music in the house. Mm-hmm. It might be a Roland Haynes doing an opera. It might be Mahalia Jackson. It might be Duke Ellington. They were multicultural in music, but just did it. They didn't talk about it. Right. So we grew up music. Yeah.
Well, there's so many wonderful music projects you've been a part of. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about Uhuru Kwanzaa, because it really was an amazing piece, and it has an amazing story. And it happened, at the time when Africa the countries were getting their independence. Beginning in 1957, Ghana gets its independence. And so by 1960, you've got like the United Nations on Uhuru Afrika.
Yeah. Well, my father was my mom and pop. I owe everything to them. Up until now, what I do came from what they gave me. Because growing up in America at that particular time, you can get a complex of your color, of your hair, of your skin, of your feet, of your body. Africa has no history. You go to cinema, and who do you see? Tarzan. And Tarzan, he was the baddest cat in Africa. He could talk to the lions, do all that type of stuff. And the Africans were always carrying things on their head. So my father, he loved Africa with such a passion. He would stop people on the street and talk about Timbuktu or talk about the Great Pyramids of Giza. My dad was a constant reader. In the house, he had books of African historians, J.A. Rogers, Hansberry, African. So he told me when I was 6 years old, and he was very strict, my father, very strict. Great cook, great chef, but serious about Africa. So he would say to me, son, when I was 6 years old, he said, listen, you are African born in America. Therefore, you're older than slavery. You're older than colonialism. You're older than corruption. You're from a very old people, the black race. And he said, but when you go outside, you're going to be smothered with lies. He would describe, when you go out in the street, Tarzan, slavery, even up to date, most of the things about slavery. We don't get information about the great African empires. So I would go to the museums because of my dad, and I'd read about Ghana, Songhai, and Nubian civilization, Egyptians. So I used to use my imagination. And there I was with African clothes, with the temples. So it started there. So finally, I met the great Melba Liston. I met her because she played trombone with Dizzy Gillespie's orchestra. And Dizzy came to Birdland one night. And the band was incredible. Lee Morgan, Jerome Richardson, Charlie Persip, Benny Golson. Dizzy had all these giants. But now everybody's in their 20s now. All these great musicians. So he introduced Melba Liston. I never saw a woman play a trombone before, number one. And she did an arrangement of My Reverie. And she got up with this big, fat sound on a trombone, and she was not a large woman. And she played, and it was so beautiful. I went up to her, I said, listen, you don't know me, my name is Randy Weston. By this time, I was working trios in New York in different clubs. But in the back of my mind is, we are a Pan-African people. We African people are all over the planet Earth. We speak many different languages. We have many different costumes. We are very diverse people. But as the great Duke Ellington said, the connection is the African pulse. Whether you call it hip-hop or jazz or blues or the black church, there's that pulse that makes the music completely unique. Music never happened before in Asia, never happened before in Europe. This African spirit that goes into Brazil and Cuba and Venezuela and Puerto Rico and Mississippi and Brooklyn. And what is it about the spirit that goes to that music? So finally, Melbourne came to New York, and by this time, I had spent some years in the Berkshires, where I got a lot of encouragement at the Music Inn, being able to hear the Boston Symphony Orchestra 7 weeks a year, and chamber music. Everybody there was into music, but the Music Inn was completely unique because at the Music Inn, Professor Marshall Stearns, with the people who owned the Music Inn, Stephanie Barber and Phil Barber, he had a Pan-African concept. So he would bring everybody from John Lee Hooker to Macbeth of the Caribbean. He had Butterfly McQueen, African-American actress. He had Haley Jackson come there and do a 15-minute talk on African spirituality in the black church. He had Dr. Willis James from Spelman College, who specialized in the field cry hollers. Right. And he would have 3 sounds and say, this is the foundation of black music, whether it's the church or jazz or whatever. So at the time, I was a breakfast cook, and I'd play at night, you know. They finally hired me as a pianist. But for everybody, I would listen and watch, like I did in Max Roach's house. Always listen, watching, trying to understand more about myself. Who am I? My mother, my father. My father was Panamanian. My mother's Virginia. I'm born in Brooklyn, New York. And they have different accents, the way they speak the English language. But they're the same people, see. So finally, because of the impact of the racism in Hollywood, I wanted to create a work of music that to show that we are a universal people, African people. And where we have been taken, we've created other civilizations. We've made things better. The Africans were taken to Brazil, they produced bossa nova, samba. You got the reggae, Trinidad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I got together with Melba, and we did, first of all, 7 waltzes for children. That was our first recording. Children climbing a hill, children singing the blues, children ice skating, a child being born, earth birth, you know, And Melba did the arrangement, and it was so beautiful that we decided to work on Uhuru Afrika. Now, what does that mean? That meant I wanted to produce a work of music to show the impact of African civilization, of world civilization, through music and voice. So I started working on the music. The first movement was called Freedom First. The second movement was called African Lady. African Lady was dedicated to our mothers, our sisters, our aunts, those women who were always in the background, who never get the credit, dedicated to her. The third movement would be Bantu, the southern part of Africa. And the last movement would be called like a blues to celebrate when African civilizations come together. In other words, when we all get together, like what happened in Nigeria in 1977. We all get together, and all of a sudden we look at each other, we listen to each other's music, and our music is different. Our music is diverse, but our music is the same, right? So I went to the United Nations, and I wanted to use an African language. By this time, many of the young African countries had the ambassadors, the young people for the first time came to the United Nations. So a good friend of mine worked there, Richard Jennings and A.C. Thompson, so I could meet the various ambassadors. So I wanted to find out if I'm going to use an African language, which I wanted to do, what language could I use? Because Africa is so diverse in languages. So the general consensus was Kiswahili. And I met a man he was from Tanzania. His name was Tutameki Sanka, and he was a teacher of Kiswahili. I went to Langston Hughes, who I had met in the Berkshires, and I said, Langston, we had become very close. I said, Langston, would you kindly write a freedom poem for me for the first movement, and would you write words for African Lady? Langston said, of course, because he was such a genius, such a gentleman, such a wonderful spirit, Langston. So we got together, and I went to the piano, as I always do with Melba. She put on a tape recorder. I said, Melba, this melody goes like this, and this rhythm goes like this, you know, and she'd make some notes. I said, African Lady, she said, okay, African Lady, we have to have some birds. Because Melba was very much in tune with nature when she wrote arrangements. She wanted to bring Mother Nature into the arrangements, whatnot. So we worked on it, and we worked on it, and finally it became Uhuru Afrika. My friend from Tanzania, he translated Langston's poem. The first movement is called Uhuru Kwanza. Uhuru Kwanza in Kiswahili means freedom first. What did that mean? That meant at that time the African countries wanted their independence. But the powers in charge said, no, we're not ready yet for independence. But the African countries were saying, we'll make our own mistakes. We want our independence now. That was the first movement. And Langston wrote such beautiful words for African Lady. Something like, goddess of sun, my lovely one, African Lady, you know, beautiful. So the orchestra, I hope I didn't forget anybody. The trumpet section, Freddie Hubbard, Clark Terry, Benny Bailey, Richard Williams. Trombone section, Slide Hampton, Quentin Jackson, Jimmy Cluden, Julius Watkins on French horn. Reed section, Yusef Lateef, Cecil Payne, Jerome Richardson, Les Spann played flute, Sahib Shahab on baritone also, Kenny Burrell on guitar. The rhythm section, Max Roach, Candido from Cuba, Armando Peraza from Cuba, Olatunji from Nigeria, Charlie Pacip on the drums, 2 bass players, Ron Carter and George DeVivier. That was the orchestra. And we had Brock Peters, who sang African Lady, and also Martha Flowers, with a beautiful voice. And Melba is such a genius. She would write an arrangement, but the last minute she would change the arrangement. So she had copyists all over my apartment before the recording date. Guys were copying parts on the ceiling, on the wall, and Melba was everywhere. And the poor copyist, he was so busy copying music, his 2 ankles swell up like we had to physically carry him down 3 flights of stairs in the chair, still writing parts.
He's still writing.
Took him to the studio. But the wonderful and the spiritual thing about this work of music is this. Candido had to go somewhere, and it was very important that Candido be part of this. So we had to arrange a recording date 2 days in a row at 9 o'clock in the morning. Everybody was on time.
Yeah, for a musician,
that's all those people, everybody was on time. So that's the story of Uhuru Afrika.
It's amazing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, and the amazing thing about that music is that it is so authentic and so powerful, and yet at that point you hadn't traveled to Africa. But then in 1961, after, in fact, the year of the release of Uhuru Afrika, you go to Nigeria. And I think I'd love for you to tell that story, because one of the things that I found amazing is, and most people may not know this, but when it was sponsored by the American Society of African Culture, and at first, they were hesitant to have you come along. They were a little bit like, well, we're not really sure. And of course, you did go along with Lionel Hampton, with everyone else. And in fact, they were kind of hesitant about jazz, but that's another story. I'd love you to talk about that first trip to Nigeria and the impact it had on you.
It was magic. It was magic. I can't remember everybody. I'll name some of them, 29 of us. Nina Simone, Lionel Hampton with 8 members of his band, Hale Woodruff. We had, of course, mentioned Langston. We had Al Mims and Leon James. These were 2 great dancers from the Savoy Ballroom. See, during those days, our answer was, for me, what happened before, I want to let you know, is royalty. We cannot touch what happened before. People like Duke and Basie, that's our royalty, because they did something that never happened before. So everything we do today comes before them. But there was no music of Ellington before Ellington. You see, so they were geniuses and whatnot. But I mentioned that, you asked me that for a reason. I got away.
Yeah, just to talk about Nigeria, the impact.
Nigeria, right.
You saw.
So I mentioned these 2 dances. So what would happen to the Savoy Ballroom? Usually when we were young, we only played dances. You had to play music for dance. Very important, So at the Savoy Ballroom, say, for example, the Ellington Orchestra would come with some brand new music. They would have the best dancers at the Savoy to create a new dance to go with the new music. Because even when I play solo piano, that dance pulse has to be there. Because African people, dance and music is one and the same. There's no separation between the 2. So they went along. And then we had Jeffrey Holder, the great Jeffrey Holder from Trinidad. He was there. Brock Peters, who sang on Uhuru Afrika. Brock was an actor, singer, wonderful artist. And we also Martha Flowers, Natalie Hinderis, who was a great pianist. So Ahmed Abdul Malik was there also. We spent 10 days in Lagos. And during the day, we would discuss everything from politics to art to poetry. For example, they would have, I forgot to mention Olatunji. Olatunji went back with us. I can't forget that, and took us to his village. So, for example, they would have some traditional dances from Nigeria. They would be on this side of the stage. Then they had the two jazz dancers from the Savoy Ballroom on this side of the stage. Then the music we played, then you could see the similarity. You can see what we do really comes from Mother Africa, although we don't realize it, you see. So it was beautiful. Then at night, me being a musician, I hung out in all the clubs, you know. And I go to a club, the owner was named Bobby Benson. Bobby played the most incredible African guitar I ever heard. He was a great drummer, but he also owned a club called the Cabin Bamboo. At this club, every night, I had an opportunity to meet all the young West African musicians. In fact, I played with Fela when he played trumpet in Nigeria. That was when I went back in 1963. And I have to say something just a little bit before. Okay. My father, he said, always use your imagination. And you use your imagination, you can go 10,000 in the future, 10,000 in the past, you know. So he said, and John Henry Clark emphasizes, says, anytime you have a problem, never forget the slave ship. Never forget, fall in love with your great-great-grandmother, great-grandfather that you never saw. Because for you to survive today, to call yourself a musician, is because of their sacrifice and their genius and their commitment to survive slavery, to survive all that stuff, produce us. So when the plane was going, we went from New York to Rome. We stopped in Rome, we went around a little bit. And when it seemed like when the pilot said, we're now coming over Africa, in my mind, it seemed like the rhythm of the plane changed. And this wasn't a jet. This was those kind of planes. Remember those planes?
Yes.
The big ones, right? So like I heard a rhythm. And I said, wow, my great-great was taken away in a boat in chains. Here I am going back to Africa in an airplane. How blessed I am. So when the plane arrived about 11 o'clock at night, so Jeffrey Holder, who's about my height, Brock Peters was very tall also. So when the door of the plane opened up, we got that smell of the West African air. I can't describe that. There's a certain, in the air, something about West Africa just coming in. And they had about 50 drummers, and they started to play. And we came down the ramp. A guy ran up to me. He said, well, he said, you've been gone 400 years. About time you came back. So I tell you honestly, I never left Africa. Mm-hmm. You see, because for me, Africa is not the geographical area that it occupies. Africa is not the people who live there. Africa is not the Sahara Desert. Africa is not Mount Kilimanjaro. Africa is not the Sahara Desert. Africa is the spirit of our ancestors. Music is spirit, our ancestors' spirit. So when I arrived in Nigeria, I never left. Spiritually, I never left Africa. I was completely at home. I went to sea always because, see, when we grew up in Brooklyn, we were taught to always hang out with the old people because they would tell us stories. Some true, some not true. But we used to hang always with the old people because they would sit and tell us stories about what happened in 18 so and we always did that. Right. So in Nigeria, I did the same. I tried to find the oldest people I can. And one event I'll never forget, I was with Olatunji, and he was going to take me to his village, and we were walking down the highway in Lagos. So we saw a guy a long way, a guy with a tall guy, you know, and we were coming like this to each other. I was coming this way, he was coming this way. So the guy with the tall guy, he ran up to us, and he talked to Olatunji in Yoruba. And what he said was, listen, I'm making you a bet. My man is taller than your man. So Olatunji said, no. He said, I'm taller, you know. But the spirit of Africa, the two of them came like this, and we came like this, you know. And I was just much taller. When we saw each other, we embraced each other. It was just pure love. And that's the magic of Africa. Africa is spirit. And I believe when you truly love the ancestors, when you truly love them, they will guide you, they will protect you, they will advise you spiritually, you see, and protect you seriously. So that was Nigeria.
Well, there's so much more. You ended up in Morocco for 7 years and ran a club. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Well, because of Fela, because of Bobby Benson, because of Sunny Ade, they had their own clubs in Nigeria. And before we even went to Nigeria, we as musicians, we were trying to organize places that we could play because it was very difficult. The salary was very low. Some of the greatest musicians you could think of had to play in clubs with no dressing rooms. It was terrible. You know, like you're a jazz musician, you get bad pianos, you get the bad conditions. That's automatically what it's supposed to be. But I knew this music was higher than what we call jazz. I knew this was spiritual. I knew Charlie Parker was as spiritual as Mahalia Jackson, you see. Because these giants, Dizzy and Duke, people, when they play their music, they take you on a spiritual high. And they play the kind of music that everybody understands because music is our first language. Music is before English, French, Arabic, all these languages that we speak today. Music was our first language. And music came out of Africa because our ancestors, when they arrived on this magnificent continent, magic continent of Africa, it's just pure magic. I tell you, it's magic. From the north to the south to the west, all the music swings. Because the music describes Africa itself, and the animals, and the insects, and the birds, and the thunder is the original music, Mother Nature. So our ancestors created music by being in touch with the planets, being in touch with the galaxies. And that's the whole creation of music. And Mother Nature ran in such a way, the elephants, they have their language. The tigers, they have their language. The lions have their language. The insects have their language. All of Mother Nature, all the creatures talk to each other through music. But I guess that's how they created music in the first place, because the whole concept of music came out of Africa. Before Europe ever existed, before Asia ever existed, our ancestors was created music. And that's why they say to us that although we left the African empires thousand years ago, we maintain our ancestral memory. The ancient Egyptians called it turaf. That means I can sit here and go back 10,000 years ago, use my imagination, use my spirit to go all the way back, you see. So it was, again, when I start talking, don't stop me. But do stop me. Well, what was the subject?
Can we get to the African Rhythms Club?
African Rhythm. Okay. That's another long story. I'll try to make it as short as possible. We did a State Department tour in 1967, and we were chosen to do 14 countries in Africa, West Africa, North Africa, and also Beirut and Lebanon. I took the great Ed Blackwell on drums, Chief Bay on African drum, Ray Copeland on trumpet, Clifford Jordan on tenor saxophone, Bill Wood on bass, and I took my son who was 15 years old. He was a very athletic type of guy, and he hurt his leg, and they told me I better take him with me, which I was very happy to do. So the last concert was Morocco. Now, by this time, I wanted to live in Africa because after being in Nigeria, I was very attracted to traditional music. I love traditional music of Asia, of Africa, because when I hear traditional music, that's where I get my ideas. From the oldest music, that's where I get my ideas, you see. So I wanted to live in Africa, Originally, I wanted to live in Nigeria, but that's when the Biafra War was going on. That was impossible. So of the tour, Morocco was the last country. We did Ghana, we did Sierra Leone, we did Gabon, we did Cameroon, we did Liberia, we did Niger, we did, I don't want to leave out any countries. Sierra Leone, I mentioned Senegal, we did Cote d'Ivoire, we did. So anyhow, Morocco was the last country. And our last concert was at a theater in Rabat called the Cinema Agdal. Now, what we did for the State Department, we did the history of jazz, which originally came from Marshall Stearns. You know, in other words, you start off with Africa. We start off with African rhythms, then we go to the Caribbean, then we go to the Black Church, then we go to the 20s, Ma Rainey, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and then we end up with the African cookbook, which meant Africa is the past, the present, and also the future. So that's what we did in all the countries, right? So anyhow, Morocco was the last country, and when you do those State Department tours, you have to make a report to decide about the tour, what you like, what you didn't like. You have to make this report to get the other part of your money, too.
It's in the archive.
Right.
So I stayed in Morocco, but the concert, the very last concert, Ed Blackwell took a solo. You see, the New Orleans drummers, they have a beat that make you want to dance. They're very unique. You know, they got a certain beat make you dance. And Ed Blackwell took a solo that was just mind-blowing. So, okay, made out my report. Goodbye, Morocco, back to New York. 1 month later, we got letters, we got phone calls, telegrams. The Moroccan people are completely crazy about our music. They want us to come back. So I didn't choose Morocco. Morocco chose me to go back. It's really just magic. So I went back with just a trio, Ed Blackwell and Bill Wood. And I stayed in Rabat 1 year. I stayed in Tangier between 5 and 6 years. And I decided I want to try to open up a club. And I talked with a guy in Rabat. We talked to each other. It just couldn't quite happen. By this time, I had brought my children with me, my daughter Pamela, my son Niles, who's called Azadine. And they told me that the best American school was in Tangier. So then I moved to Tangier so they could go to school. And in Tangier, I met a Moroccan guy. He was a gendarmerie, loved music, and he had a copy of Uhuru Afrika, which I was surprised, you know. So finally we got together and we found a place, and we opened up a club we called it African Rhythms Club. Now, this club was not intended necessarily to be a nightclub, but in my dream, up until this minute, that every country in Africa would have a situation where we could go and experience the traditional music of that particular country. Because the beauty of Africa is a diversity. You can stay in one country 2 or 3 years and not record all the music. If you go north, south, Africa is so diverse because the continent is so diverse. So the music captures the continent. So the music is very diverse and whatnot. So we opened up this club called the African Rhythms Club. And we're in its heyday, 1969, 1970. We'd have a blues band from Chicago. We'd have singers from the Congo singing in Lingala. We'd have the Moroccan Ganawa people. So the whole idea was to have the spirit of international Africa, African people from the States, from the Caribbean and whatnot. And we all listened to each other. And that was the experience, yeah. So that's the history of the club, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so since our time is running short, I had one last question to sort of close out. But before that, I have to say something. I just can't help myself. But this archive is extraordinary. And everything that Randy's talking about is reflected in these documents in some extraordinary depth. And there's one, you don't have to talk about it, but there's one letter that I just have to talk about because it's so amazing. So among many things that Randy has done. He's an organizer. He organized Ndugungobon. He organized the Afro-American Musicians Association, and he was involved with a lot of, and something that Ingrid writes beautifully about, a lot of benefits for the civil rights movement. And after the March in Washington, Randy writes this extraordinary letter that basically he writes it to Dr. King, to James Farmer, to John Lewis, to Whitney Young, to Roy Wilkins, and says, the March in Washington was great, I appreciate that, but I have two complaints. One, you had no jazz musicians up there. None. And once again, we're excluded. And then the second thing, I may not remember this, but he says in the letter, and I picked up Ebony Magazine's Emancipation Centennial Edition, and you had no jazz musicians in there. And he's like, something has to be done. So I just think a lot of the organizing and work has been to bring visibility to this music. And it's there. We think of musicians as making music and going to recording sessions, but he did all this writing and work and organizing and making connections, and that just has to be acknowledged. I just want to say, it's in there. It's in the record.
It's in there.
So, but see, my question, though, because since our time is short, is really about now. You're about to release this incredible record, the African Nubian Suite. Your music is the soundtrack for this new documentary on Cheikh Anta Diop. If you could talk about the work that you're doing now and the significance of this now, and now at 90 years old, still working.
Well, you have so much to learn because, the most difficult thing to do, I believe, is to create new music. Because there's been a lot of music. I don't know where it goes. I'm not sure if the music stays up there or disappear. I don't know where all those notes go. But people have been playing music for a long, long time. I don't know where they go. So it's like, okay, we have to learn more about the spirituality of African people. Going back to my mother and father, because not only did they have best music in the house, when you came to the house, you had to eat. It's very important, food in Africa. Yeah. You can't come by and just, it's part of the culture. The music and the food, they go together. And so my dad, when he would cook, he put certain spices in the food, So if I'm going to play a gig, I'm very strong. I'm very strong because of the food, because African people, they had to have the genius of giving the worst of everything. Slavery days, after that, the worst food, and make delicacies out of it, Going back to that cultural meaning of ancient Africa, where the whole concept of cooking created, So it's like I want to produce a work of music. Robert Kelly wrote some incredible notes about this work of music. I have 4 scholars on these 2 CDs. I have the great Robin Kelly. His notes are so precious. And the recording, we had it translated to French, English, and Spanish, my new recording. It's a double CD. It's called the African Nubian Suite. The first thing we put out ourselves. And we go back 4.5 million years ago. I was looking at a television show on National Geographic, and this show had Paula Zahn. That was her show. And she had these anthropologists and Egyptologists on this program. And in the Ethiopian desert, they discovered this woman who was 4.5 million years old. 1 million years older than Lucy, because Lucy was supposed to be our oldest. Well, she's 4.5 million years old. And they found her bones in the desert. And it took them about 20 years to put these bones together to see what she must have looked like. Now, at that time, Ethiopia was all forest. It was all forest at that particular time. So they discovered, this is from the University of Michigan, University of Chicago, and the anthropologists, Egyptologists in Ethiopia, they discovered that she walked upright in the forest. Now, they said we're supposed to continue from the chimpanzee, because chimpanzee walks on all fours, We say, this sister, she walked upright, and she walked upright like that, Although her feet still could hold the branches, but she didn't walk on all fours, she walked upright, So they call her Ardipithecus, and they call her Ardi for short. So when I saw this program, I said, wow, that's our oldest mother. 4.5 million years ago. I said, I want to check her out. So first, I fell in love with her, because everything we do is about love. I have to point that out. Everything that we're talking about now is deep love of humanity, of understanding, of truth. And we have to bring the motherland. That's the mystery place, Africa. Even, I've been involved all my life. I know this much about Africa, because Africa is spirit. It's not something that you just think, no. So anyhow, I wanted to create this work of music, and I got Professor Wayne Chandler, who wrote a brilliant book called Ancient Future. And he does the narration. He talks about her. And we also have a woman from China, Ming Xiaofeng. And we talk about the Shang dynasty, which was the African Chinese dynasty, going all the way back. You have Qia, you have the Shang dynasty. And I met this woman named Ming Xiaofeng, and Ming, she was in Atlanta, Georgia, with Mortian. And she heard me play solo piano. She came to me, she says, I love your solo piano. She said, I play the pipa. I said, what's the pipa? She said, this is a 2,000-year-old Chinese instrument. So she came to my house. She lived in Brooklyn at that time, and she played for me this instrument. It was so beautiful. At the same time, at the Guggenheim Museum, they had a 5,000-year exhibition on the history of Chinese civilization. The two of us went to this exhibition, and we saw the mask of the Shang dynasty, pure African, big-eyed, thick lips, everything, Africa. And so from that, we created a piece, piano and pipa, about the Shang dynasty. And then we did T.K. Blue. He does a piece with kora. And we have a kora player, his name is Suso, and he tells the story of a great spiritual civilization in Senegal called Tuba. Very beautiful. So it's flute and kora. Myself, piano, and bellophone, we tell the stories of my grandchildren in Senegal, you see. And we have Howard Johnson. Howard Johnson, he starts off, see, he's the first solo artist. He plays tuba. So in his imagination, I said, listen, on the tuba, you have to imagine how Artie walked in the forest. So he uses imagination to demonstrate. And then I had Ganawa, a Ganawa musician, and piano. So the whole idea was not only the history of Nubia, which is older than Egypt, Kush, which is older than Egypt, the first civilization that we know in Africa, but at the same time to show Billy Harper, for example, I wanted to show in our imagination what happened when the first African saw a piano. What did he do with it? What happened when the first African saw a trumpet? What did he do with it? What happened when the first African saw a saxophone? What did he do with it? So that's the African Nubian Suite. And I have I forgot. We started off honoring Candido. Candido was now 95 years old. When we did the recording, he was 91, still a master from Cuba. And also we want to demonstrate the respect for the elders and the ancestors. So we had him as the oldest. Because today there's a tendency to, because of the machines and the computers, and people say, oh, old people, they know nothing. Old people have wisdom, they have experience, you see. So that's the story of the African Nubian Suite. Yeah, I cut it short, but I'm very proud of it. Thank you.
Well, I I think everyone wants to hear the band now.
Right.
So we will come back in 5 minutes. We'll just reset the stage.
Make it 10 minutes.
Okay, all right. Whatever you say. And we'll start the music. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
The great Robert Hill. He'll be back.